Hello, and welcome to Workplace Stories, the podcast where human capital experts share their real-world experiences and insights. Hosted by Red Thread Research, Workplace Stories surfaces the latest industry trends, innovative talent strategies, and best practices for success. Tune in for practical advice on how to best transform your workplace.
Welcome to Workplace Stories. I'm Stacia Garr.
And I'm Danny Johnson.
And today we interviewed David Edwards, who is the author of a new book called the Strategic Workforce Planning Handbook. Danny, we haven't done workforce planning in a while. This is kind of a new topic for us. So what stood out for you?
Yeah, I think just his definition first of what strategic workforce planning is. When we think of strategic workforce planning, we think of strategically planning all of the workforce. But the way that he sort of addressed it was strategic workforce planning as workforce planning for the strategic things in an organization. So not addressing everything, but addressing the things that really matter. I think that makes it more approachable to organizations that are just getting started. And I also think it probably makes it a little bit more effective. I also really love the way that he talked about HR in general. He said something that sticks with me. I'm probably going to embroider it on a pillow. HR knows things. There is a level of knowledge and insight that they have about how things operate from the people perspective that often goes untold in other parts of the organization. And so he talked a lot about having uncomfortable discussions or surfacing uncomfortable things in rooms and making sure that you're brave enough to do that. And then I think the final point that really stood out to me is we talked a little bit about skills, and he sort of broadened my idea of information that can be used for strategic workforce planning and decision-making more broadly. He talked a lot about contextual data. So not just do they have the skill, but do they want to exercise that skill in that way? Are they willing to take on leadership? Just all kinds of contextual stuff that is going to help you make better decisions that plays into this idea of workforce planning. Stacia, what stood out to you?
So we talked at the very beginning about why strategic workforce planning is a thing right now, because it's very cyclical. Over all the years I've been doing this, it comes into vogue and then it goes out of vogue and then it's back. And so why is it back right now? And he mentioned that there is just so much coming at us, and we all know many of the things, we talk about them in our megatrends research, but that strategic workforce planning is a way of trying to understand what may come. And I actually put it in the futurist terms that Lisa K. Solomon taught us around, it's a way to try to envision different futures that may exist and to understand how you might need to respond in different ones. He kind of references that sometimes we try to over-precision workforce planning, and that's not actually where the value is. I think it is in that kind of futuring where you can see those different futures that may exist. So that was one thing for me. The other thing is he did talk about this whole tasks conversation in the context of skills and how we need to be breaking work down into the tasks to understand how we're actually going to plan for the future. I think that's one of the things that's interesting about that we actually didn't go into is if tasks are the thing that, or at least one of the things that we're going to look forward, then how does that connect to, AI agents and AI agent capacity planning and all the rest of that? And we've actually got a study on the roadmap for the second half of the year to look into that, kind of expanding beyond just, people and workforce planning and thinking more about augmented capacity and the like. But this I thought was a really nice intro to that, if you will, in terms of how we're thinking about what strategic workforce planning really is and how it's different from the past.
I don't know that it struck me until today how many things it encompasses. You know what I mean? It's not just numbers on a sheet. It encompasses pretty much all of the people practices and them working together in order to make the right decisions around people.
And the final thing that he talked about that I think is important is around, how does HR make this happen? One thing is with the confidence and the clarity and recommendations based on the data and the scenarios and the like. And then we also talked about, well, what if you have all that, but you've got an organization that's not listening? And he said, well, it's time to get political. It's time to find others who can help make your case. And I think that's absolutely true. And I love that he made that point. So for those of you listening, we hope you enjoyed this version of Workplace Stories. We really enjoyed learning more about strategic workforce planning. Suggest that you check out David's book. Again, that's called the Strategic Workforce Planning Handbook. And we look forward to hearing your comments as well. Welcome to Workplace Stories, David. We are so excited to have you here.
Oh, it's very, very nice to be here. It's nice of you to ask me. Thank you.
Yes, well, we are here to talk about workforce planning generally, as well as your new book, which is, I believe, called the Strategic Workforce Planning Handbook. Help our audience get to know you just a little bit and to, sorry, what are you guys giggling at?
Well, he held up the book. He's like, oh, you said the thing, and then he's held up the book. That's what I was laughing
perfect.
at.
The now best-selling Strategic Workforce Planning Handbook, the publishers decided to slap a little sticker on the latest promotional material. I don't know whether, I think you have to set these things in context. It could well be that it's sort of, just 20 copies more than they normally sell, but I'll take whatever they're giving.
Absolutely.
So, yes, I am David. In 7 weeks' time, I'm an old age pensioner here in the UK, but I've been doing strategic workforce planning for about the last 15 years. And prior to that, I was in finance and operations and in software startups. I've done a variety of things over my time. And the less we say about my spending a year operating tumble dryers in a psychiatric hospital laundry, the better. But the one good thing came from it, BC, because my very last week there, I actually met my wife, with whom I celebrate 40 years of wedded bliss in June.
That's
so
amazing.
There you go.
That is. Congratulations. So you mentioned that you have been doing this for 15 years, for the last 15 years, and a much broader set of experiences for that. Can you tell us a little bit about the types of organizations you worked in, just so people have a sense of kind of where you're from?
So I kind of briefly mentioned software startups. So that's sort of, it was mostly in the the technology financials, ledgers, that kind of thing. I have also worked for one of the main players in our current space, Vizia, for a short period of time. I've worked in telecommunications with Ericsson most recently, also the UK NatWest Bank. Did a lot of work in the financial services sector in the late 90s. Also worked in Shelton, Connecticut for a US technology company. And prior to that, did a little bit of freelancing and also worked for the United Kingdom National Health Service for 10 years as an accountant. So it's kind of a bit of this, bit of that, jack of all trades and master of, well, I'd like to say several.
Well, I think you're going to hear about some of those today. I don't know that we even need to ask this question kind of based on how you've answered the first two, but we always ask our guests, why should we listen to you on the topic of...
I come across as not taking life, I suppose, especially seriously. I put things in their proper place. There's lots of other stuff happening in the world, and our world of work, important as it is because it involves people, is nevertheless not necessarily a matter of life and death. But having said that, what we do in this space affects people, and it affects people in the most visceral of ways. So I believe it's important to anchor what I talk about in the messy realities of the workplace. They're not pristine, they're not simple. And I think give voice to what it's like to be a practitioner. And it doesn't have to be at SWP. In any parts of HR, it's not always a fun thing. It's not always easy. And so I like to try to be authentic and real.
I like that. I think it bodes well for the discussion we're going to have.
Oh, you might have heard the best already.
Maybe. We'll see.
So let's turn to that topic of strategic workforce planning, SWP. And we have been hearing just tons of interest on this. Like, I think about 24 months ago, I said to Danny, I was like, workforce planning it's back. It's back. And with that, though, comes lots of confusion, right? So what is strategic workforce planning? What is work planning? What is short-term operational planning? What are all these things? For the sake of today, though, we're focused on strategic workforce planning. So what does that usually mean in your world and also to leaders? And what do you think leaders may sometimes miss when they're thinking about that term workforce planning?
Well, I think the easy miss is the assumption that this is long-term headcount planning. And SWP planning can be strategic depending upon how short your current time frame is. I've worked in a couple of companies where planning 15 months ahead was strategic compared to how they were planning in the past. To my mind, SWP asks a very simple question, which is your workforce fit for its future business purpose? Now, that hides a multitude of sins. Now, if the answer to it is yes, well, there are no other questions except, why are you lying to me? Because I don't believe that anybody's is. The second question which follows is, what risks then are there to the execution of business strategy if it's not fit? And how on earth do we mitigate that risk to the benefit of the business and to the optimum benefit of its people? That doesn't mean it has to be about numbers. It means it has to be about what are the responses that we have to be prepared for in the event of anticipated change. It's very much about what's the change to the workforce. And my thinking has changed on this since I first started practicing it. I used to think it was strategically planning for the whole workforce, and now I think it's much more planning for that part of the workforce which is strategic. And therein, I think, lies a clue to the potential for SWP to become a really valuable part of the business strategy planning and execution process.
Why do you think it's seen a resurgence in the last 18 months or so?
I saw a great advert for People Analytics World in Zurich, and it said, how do you plan in an era of uncertainty? And the uncertainty word was sort of fading away into absolutely nothing. I can't recall, I was a child probably, when there was last such global uncertainty, when there were last so many different influences, forces and drivers, which were all posing questions about what the future is going to be. And I think that when you add that to the known shortages that we have of talent, the known reducing half-life of skills, and the known challenges with generational shifts and geopolitics, you simply can't afford to sort of assume that you're just going to be able to keep on hoovering up workers from sort of the outside market to do your bidding. It simply isn't going to work that way. You've got to try to lay down some tracks, some kind of plan.
I really like that answer. So I just want to repeat some of the things that you said. Geopolitical unrest or uncertainty. We don't know where people can work and where they can't work. You talked about the half-life of skills. You've talked about scarcity of talent, I think, in the marketplace. Were there others that I missed?
Well, there was one I didn't actually mention. I think I've tried to do as best I can to keep the dreaded letters AI out of the conversation so far. I mean, look, we're about 10 minutes in, and I got away with it that far. I have a mixed view about AI. Yes, it feels fundamental, but there again, so did Y2K. There again, so did the advent of computers. And one of my favorite stories in the book, Barbara Tuchman, fantastic American author, Pulitzer Prize winner, pointed out that the 19th century began very much the way that the 18th, 17th, or even the 3rd had. And yet by the end of that century, we had the steam engine, we had electricity, we had gas, we had lighting, we had the telegraph, people about to fly. The scale of change in that period was extraordinary. There must have been a feeling that how on earth are we going to get through all of this? How are we going to deal with it? We did. There is a resilience in people and an ability for things to sort of shake through. But right now, it feels scary.
I wonder, the urge for strategic workforce planning is really just a reflection of a human urge for control.
Yes, and therein lies a paradox, because in its best, most articulate and useful form, SWP is an exercise in vague, because the very precision and the very certainty that people hope to drive out of such a thing cannot possibly be guaranteed.
Yeah. I think, just reflecting back on our Elevate conference last year and some of the conversations we had there with particularly Lisa K. Solomon, who's a designer in residence and futurist at the Stanford D School, we talked about how there's kind of an implicit agreed upon future, and then there are other futures which may exist, but about which you do not speak. I think one of the things that's powerful about strategic workforce planning is it can give us nothing else than numbers and the structure to talk about what those other futures might be in a way that business leaders can concretely understand. Whether those futures come to pass or not is obviously a different story, but being able to say, if this, then that, is, I think, a super powerful.
I think that's exactly right. I'm going to be on a plane to Las Vegas in, a month's time for Unleash. And
yeah, I'm going to see you there, I think.
Yeah, I hope so. That'll be lovely to meet up, actually. When that plane takes off, we know it's going to Las Vegas. Strategically, it is going to Las Vegas. There will be things which sort of may buffet it along the way, but very few of those will alter the strategic direction. But there may be something that comes across, a sandstorm, who knows, that sort of, that suddenly forces us to divert. And that's, I like using analogies. I'm afraid it's sort of, probably I use analogies to death, but I think that it's a good way of trying to sort of make the complex simple in space. Because, SWP is actually a very simple thing at its heart. It's just that we run the risk of overcomplicating it sometimes.
So one of the things I really liked about your book, which aligns with this, is this idea that strategic workforce planning isn't really an HR exercise. And even in some organizations, it literally is not an HR exercise. It's in finance or it's in some strategic operations part of the business. But ultimately, wherever it sits, it's a business exercise. So in your experience, what starts to shift when leaders start treating it as a business exercise versus as something that HR is doing just to figure out headcount in the future?
I think from a business leadership point of view, it becomes a risk and a feasibility process. I think it requires HR to initiate the conversation, because we know things about people and people dynamics and recruitment dynamics that the business often overlooks. If only we would use it to say, your strategy as laid out won't necessarily work, or it certainly won't cost what you think it's going to cost but for that to happen, you have to synthesize all of the different pieces of knowledge that we have. And I think this is a problem with many of the tech offerings that we've got at the moment, that they can sort of kind of take you to within about 100 yards of Grand Central Station, but you've still got to walk the rest of the way. There's another analogy, you see. We can influence the business about what is strategically possible, and we can also educate it on what trade-offs are possible. For us to do that, not only do we have to think of this as a business process, but we also have to think business more perhaps than we do at present. And you could argue, as you say, that there are different leaders who take responsibility for it, that perhaps it is a new branch of HR, not necessarily strategic workforce planning per se, but business strategy delivery.
I think this is a really interesting discussion because it seems like it sort of parallels the discussions. I'm going to use the term AI again. Sorry. But it parallels some of the discussions that we're having with organizations about AI and technology in general. So some of those decisions, especially with respect to people tech, are being made elsewhere. They're not being made with HR at all. And so, or job structure or even work structure. These decisions are being made and they're saying, hey, we can, reduce this amount of headcount, or if we do the process like this, it can look like this and blah. And HR is being introduced much later in the process, at which point they're like, okay, but did you think about this or this or this, much like you just said. So it's interesting to me that, you made a very good case for HR sort of leading this, or at least influencing where it is, understanding where it sits in the organization and going after it. In many organizations, HR isn't particularly strategic. So I'm wondering, what advice do you have for those of you who are listening? David just rolled his eyes. I'm wondering what advice you have to HR organizations that maybe aren't involved in these discussions right now.
Start telling your business things that you know that you think they should be aware of. Start asking questions about what the people analytics that are almost always available now, especially in large organizations, what are they actually telling you that could have an impact on the business? The word I would like using at the minute is synthesis. People analytics without the context of what the business strategy is or what the business challenge is, it's just a set of numbers. But as soon as you start to sort of layer these things one atop the other, all of a sudden a story starts to emerge. Oh, crikey, there's this small function over here, which is sort of, really important for the company because of its revenue generating ability. But look, half of these people are sort of getting old. I'm allowed to say that because I am old already. And looking out at the market, actually, these people are not 10 a penny. You're going to struggle to actually get some business. We've got a problem here. We need to start talking about how we're going to address it. Now, sometimes they won't listen, but I think you have to be prepared to be persistent.
So you also said something earlier about your view of strategic workforce planning changing to be focusing on the workforce planning for strategic areas of the organization. In a lot of organizations, that is the leadership roles, director level and above, and it becomes more of like a succession planning exercise than workforce planning. I'm wondering, first of all, what do you think about that? I think I have an idea of what you think about that. But secondly, how do you broaden HR's views so that they're not thinking strategic as just leadership, but also thinking of it in terms of the skills we need in the organization?
I kind of alluded to it just now, really, in that I used an exemplar actually for a real life situation where there was a small function which is very high revenue generating and has some demographic challenges. Now, none of the people in that organization are probably anything more than C-4, yet as individuals, as individual contributors and as a team of people, they are hugely important. If you were to take the 10-figure sum out of the equation as a consequence of no longer having those people there, that would be of material concern to the board. Those are the kind of things that HR can make a difference in. But the strategic workforce plan in that instance is a response to a specific business problem, which I think SWP should be about anyway, as opposed to just something that someone's told you ought to do. And it is coming up with not just a plan, but strategic approaches to delivery. We all talk about build, buy, borrow, bot. How do we combine those things? And what does that actually mean? And I'm going to do my old favorite sort of thing. So here's the life cycle of an employee. And typically, the point at which we think we've got a problem or we need to do something about those people is about here. So you've got next to no time to do anything about it. Now, if you're looking strategically, you're taking that point of awareness back to there. And that gives you a window of opportunity, not just to act, but to act differently. And it's the acting differently that really matters. That could be longer term, more structured training. It could be having employment pipelines. It could be negotiating deals with vendors and then merging those things together so that you have a uniform but flexible approach to meeting the needs that you've got that keeps you competitive, but in the long term also rewards those people that you've actually hired as part of your organization.
If you're a senior people leader, you know the hard part isn't finding ideas. It's deciding which ones are worth acting on. That's why Red Thread created Summit 2026. It's not a conference. It's a small, invitation-only working retreat. On June 23rd, senior HR leaders will gather in Snowbird, Utah for 3 days of guided, peer-driven work grounded in research. No keynotes, no vendor pitches, no passive audiences. Leaders will leave having strengthened the people strategies they've been grappling with for years, with clearer direction on what to change, what to stop, and what to double down on. If you want to be part of that conversation, learn more and request an invitation over at redthreadresearch.com.
I want to talk a little bit about skills. You just mentioned the point about skills being potentially part of strategic workforce planning. How do you see that happening? How do you see skills fitting into strategic workforce planning when it's done well? And what happens maybe when it's the starting point instead of an output?
I've had a bit of a love-hate relationship with skills. I've been involved in developing job and skills taxonomies for about 11, 12 years and kind of seen at firsthand the obsolescence that often comes along with an in-house skills taxonomy. And I would strongly advocate, and not because anyone's paying me, nobody pays me. It's very upsetting. But yeah, I would strongly advocate that people look for renewable sources of skills that are being harvested from cyberspace in general. I think AI has exposed a sort of an Achilles heel for skills, because the question is, how are we going to harness AI? The answer isn't to be found directly in skills. It is to be found, I would suggest, more in how the work is going to change. And in defining how the work looks different, how the tasks look different, then you understand what skills you're going to need to develop in the people that continue to do human work. So I wouldn't say that, skills has been debunked, far from it, but I think that it needs to let the sort of the task conversation actually give it a reason for being there. At the moment, we've got sort of lots of data warehouses telling us that so-and-so's got this skill, that skill, or the other skill, but we don't quite seem to be able to sort of make that leap to here's why we need it.
Well, I think that the challenge is that the concept of skills is pre-AI, if you will, and is being pushed into the AI conversation as potentially the way we'll redesign work. But I don't think that's realistic. So skills are attributes of people. Tasks are attributes of jobs, and people with skills do tasks. So tasks is kind of the piece in between, the Rosetta Stone between the two. And so from my perspective, I don't think that skills are any less important or passé or whatever. They just are not the tool to do the thing that now everybody wants to do. They're a tool to understand what skills and capabilities people have and how we might develop them.
But I think I would like us to get to the place where we look at people in the round. Skills are one planet orbiting the solar system of a person. Yeah. Other attributes are also available, such as, yes, they may have the skills, but are they evidenced in actual execution, in work? Are those individuals of a mind to actually want to do something for which there is a skills requirement? Have they only just moved into a particular job? Have they moved into a different locality? What things have they done in the past which may actually help them to sort of take that path after all, when there may be a question mark over the sort of this just the skill on its own. So I think we have to be prepared to look at the other planets which orbit the certain knowledge we have about people. And that is a link I would love to see. I'd love to see, for example, enterprise portfolio management systems like PlanView passing information about what people have done into our knowledge of what people can do.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because what you're basically talking about is, I don't want to say it this way, but I'm going to say it this way, chunking up jobs, right? So most organizations still think in terms of a role or a job, and there are skills associated with that. And I'm assuming that that has a really large role to play in the workforce planning. You workforce plan by job in a lot of organizations rather than by something else.
Yes.
And so I'm curious about what happens in these organizations when we're planning around the work instead of the jobs. What does that look like, and what kind of mindset shift does it take, and what kind of like data and structure shift does it take?
I'm not going to be terribly helpful
Oh, come on.
Actually, no. I'm going to say because I'm curious too. There are definitely some companies that are now starting to look at this from a technological perspective. And there's a couple. There's Talent Rewired, which only just got kind of announced just recently. There's a couple of others which are starting to sort of appear on the horizon that are sort of looking at existing jobs, applying the AI ability index or the algorithm area. And there's an awful lot of those about now, and suggesting, therefore, by sort of using lots of different pieces together that you might be able to do something different. From a practice point of view, I think people are still struggling to even get to first base. Now, again, there'll be exceptions, and they're probably in the most sort of forward-thinking and advanced companies. But at the moment, I think it's difficult. It's difficult for me to get my head around. I know that's where we need to go, but I think that it's evolving in practice as opposed to being fully fleshed in any way. It could be the precursor to genuine gig working, and we don't actually reconstitute people at all.
I'm curious about moving to skating to the puck, because the way that we seem to be addressing this right now is the skills that we need for the roles that we have now, or the skills that we need for the roles that we have in the future, not the skills that we need for the way that work is going to be done in the future. That's the thing that's getting me about workforce planning, because I don't know that I've seen most organizations have a terribly enlightened view of skating to the puck, right? So AI, again, I'm going to say it is changing the way that we're doing work, and it will change the way that work is organized within our organizations. And so if that is true, then how do you... I feel like I'm dancing around this. And I'm not.
I get it. I get it completely, Danny. We need to develop the ability to ask probing questions and to have a stock of them sort of in our locker when we go to meet business leaders. And the thing is that OKRs and goals are being set, irrespective as to whether or not we know exactly how AI is going to make a difference. But people are nevertheless putting stakes in the ground and saying, this is the OKR I'm prepared to sign up to. And take the example, 70% of all of our level 2, level 3 calls are going to be addressed by AI. Excellent stuff. So how did you get to that? Presumably you had a little think about what that might mean in practice. Give me some idea of sort of, because if you're going to sign up to that OKR, you must have thought, this is how I'm actually going to get us there. So talk to me. Tell me what the workplace then looks like. And you've always got to prise open that thinking to sort of get into all right, well, if that's what it looks like, then, what about these people? Where are they going to be? Oh, I don't know. Well, how are you going to sort of manage the monitoring and the moderation of these AI conversations? Presumably, they're going to need humans sat at the back to actually sort of be prepared to step in. Am I right or am I wrong? And business partners are going to be the front line in asking these questions. Strategic workforce planners simply won't be able to do that. The business partner, by definition, should know their business.
Should.
Okay, David, we're going to take a breath here and move to the lightning round, which is our opportunity for our audience to get to know a little bit more about you. So would love to lead off with a question about your favorite travel story.
Okay, so when I was 18, I did a year in Kenya, a little bit like the Peace Corps, but sort of a little bit more British. In other words, a much less organized setup. So I was in my last week also of the entire year, and I and a fellow volunteer climbed about Kenya. I'd say it's not a challenging climb, although it has 2 peaks, which are extremely sort of dangerous. There's a third peak, which isn't. So you can climb up to about 16 or 17,000 feet. Anyway, on the last morning, just before I was going to climb to the summit, there were various huts, and this enormous Canadian, about twice the size of me, leapt out of his bunk and landed with his boots on my right toe, my right big toe, breaking it. I realized that when I got down sort of to the youth hostel and saw this sort of blue and black and yellow thing staring back at me. Anyway, I had to walk on it, and it's about 10, 15 miles from the summit down through swamp to get to the youth hostel. I slept there. The next morning, I was hobbling along, trying to get to the main road to hitch a ride to Nairobi. And out of nowhere came this tiny little car traveling at tremendous speed, screeched to a halt, and there's this priest who's looking back at me, and he says in a broad Chicago accent, which I can't replicate, "Do you need a lift?" And I said, yes, please, if you jolly well don't mind. And I experienced for the next 45 minutes the most hair-raising journey I think I'd ever encountered. He had his rosary wrapped around his hand, wrapped around the steering wheel, was kind of sort of driving at breakneck speed. Even an atheist, was prepared to say a few Hail Marys at the end of that. Yes, that was probably the best story. Oh, and I turned up at the end of the journey to where the new batch of volunteers had just arrived, and I think they looked in horror at what had happened to this 18-year-old who was now sort of bearded and sort of, caked in mud and generally exhausted.
That's amazing.
Sorry, that's a rather long story, but
I appreciate you putting the height in feet for our American audience.
I'm old school.
Okay, second question is, what is the most impressive thing you know how to do?
Actually, well, there are two answers. One, I can whistle in harmony. For some reason, I can do a 2-part harmony when I'm whistling. I'm not going to try to do it now because it won't work. Yeah.
That's crazy.
Well, I find it quite useful because I used to sing in a soul band, just for the fun of it. And I was always responsible for orchestrating the harmonies. And so, that's the second part. But anyway, I think the thing I enjoy the most is holding an audience. I am, contrary to appearances, I'm quite introverted. And I get very nervous before these kind of things. And yet when I get up on stage, I feel as though I can get away with pretty much anything. I feel somehow I know how to sort of where to take an audience and how to sort of get them going. And it's just the most liberating thing. You either love it or you hate it, but I love it.
Okay, final question. What is the best prank you've experienced or planned?
I'm a soppy old romantic, and I was working in Connecticut. Has to have been 1999. Yes, it would have been. And I would fly out on a Monday, stay the weekend, and then come back on the following Thursday to arrive on the Friday. So that meant I was going to miss my wife's birthday. I was going to arrive a day late. So she told me that she was being picked up at a particular time. I changed my flight to fly back a day early. I knew where she was going, and I had spoken to the restaurant to ask them if I could wait at her table. And they gave me the uniform, and I rang her using a US phone card. You remember you had those phone cards. So I dialed the US number so it sounded like I was dialing transatlantically. There was a bit of a sort of a delay. And she picked up the phone and said, hello. And said, oh, darling, I'm sorry, I overslept. You're right. And I knew she was about to be picked up. Well, it's a bit late now because I'm about to be picked up. So sorry. Anyway, I said the starter, main course, and dessert before she knew it was me who was serving it.
No!
And all her girlfriends were sort of around and they could see. That was quite fun.
That's amazing.
That's awesome.
So we talked a little bit about AI, David, probably more than I wanted to. But I'm curious, I think it's an important consideration. We have to consider it in everything that we do. So I'm curious, everything seems to be changing so quickly. What do you think HR leaders are being forced to do differently when it comes to workforce planning than they've done in the past?
We can't ignore it. We can't just sort of treat it as sort of any other thing. Not only is it sort of impacting the way HR does things, but it's also impacting the way everybody is doing things. There is a general feeling I have about, and we talked already about this sort of layering, this sort of synthesis of different things. We have it within our grasp to be able to start telling the organization which things matter and which things we can perhaps treat in a slightly more commoditized way. Identify those segments which are of a particular importance to the business, but use the information that we're getting not just to report it, but to start to influence. There's a hierarchy, a bit like Maslow's triangle, oh, I produce reports. Oh, I describe reports. I analyze reports. I advise on what the reports say. I'm influencing the business. HR needs, I think, if it is to move beyond the transactional, it needs to be the influencer, and doing so by virtue of going not just with a problem, but with a solution. You do this, this happens. We could do this, and that will sort of give you some leeway, that kind of thing.
I think one of the things that's interesting about a real strategy, and Danny and I talk about this even with Red Thread, is real strategy tells you what you're going to do as much as it tells you what you're not going to do. And I think that strategic workforce planning does the same. It can constrain options. So what does it actually look like then in your experience when through the strategic workforce planning process, it forces leaders to say, hey, we can't actually do all of this? What's that look and feel like?
Difficult sometimes, not least because that kind of conversation isn't necessarily expected from HR. It's an uncomfortable truth. Another analogy very quickly for you. A colleague of mine, when I was researching the book, I spoke to about 60 different practitioners. And one of them said it's a bit like sort of telling the emperor they've got no clothes. What happened to the little boy who actually called out the emperor in the story? Nothing. The boy never features again. And what happened to the emperor? He kept walking as though nothing had happened. You can lead a horse to water. You can't necessarily make it drink. But I think you can point out the risks. And I think you also have to be prepared to lay out the cost of not having done something and say, look, I told you there was going to be this problem. The classic problem is a budget. The annual budget setting goes on way too long for investment portfolio programs. All of a sudden, we're in January and there's this mad scramble to get people. Oh, and guess what? They're not there. We need to be up there in August, September saying they're not going to be there. And these are your choices. And that's what you need to be doing. But it takes time for people to get the hang of. This is a mindset shift.
Maybe to wrap up this part of the discussion, if HR does do this well, if they are able to do it really well and partner with the right people in the organization and be in the right rooms where all the things are happening, how does its role in the organization change?
It becomes a contributor to the strategy of the business as opposed to a receiver of it. It becomes genuine advisor to business leaders and not merely a repository for procedural transactions and a doer of transactional deeds. It becomes a server, a service for the business that the business values beyond the traditional. Oh, guess what? We've already got the people. We've got them half lined up already. We've already gone through the pre-employment screening for this particular cohort. They've already had the training. We're ready to roll with them. So really, seriously, normally we're talking this amount of time to sort of go through all of that process. No, you already had a plan in place. You're already aiming towards the kind of things that we want as a business, and you're looking to hire things the right way. We can short circuit that, make your life that much easier.
What do you think we have to let go of? What do you think HR has to let go of in order to be that strategic partner?
Silos, our current mindset, and I think one of the biggest things stopping HR from sort of occupying this space is HR itself and its reluctance to move into that rather more uncertain void. Yes, our reticence. As I say again, we know things. We can join these dots together and actually show that we know an awful lot more than people give us credit for. We have to start talking about risk, and we have to be oriented around the delivery of business goals, understanding that by delivering business goals, we actually deliver for the people as well, because those things will flow naturally.
So I think that's all true. And yet many leaders will say, I'm trying to do this, but the business simply will not listen. For many of them, I don't think they're wrong. Like, particularly when you see somebody who comes in from a progressive organization to an organization where that is not how HR has operated, and therefore they have no expectation that's what they would do. In environments like that, do you have any recommendations for how HR leaders should proceed?
Persist. Be political. Everybody else is being political. Yeah. But seriously, why not? Why not? Everybody, everyone is playing hardball. We can do that too. We can raise risks, and we don't have to raise risk as the business. We could go to operational risk if we want to, and actually start to engage the risk part of the business and say, we think this is a problem. Do you? Yeah. The danger comes.
So borrowing credibility.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yes. I'm glad you thought of that, because I would never have done. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If one set of people, a set of ears is not going to listen, well, find a set of ears that will. And in my time, I've had to kiss an awful lot of frogs before I found any princes.
I think my favorite quote from this entire thing is, we know stuff. I actually think that sums up nicely a couple of things. The fact that HR often doesn't feel empowered to speak up and doesn't speak up. And also the fact that their point of view is missing from some of these really large decisions in organizations.
Yes.
Final question. We ask this question to everybody that comes on our podcast, David. Why do you do the work that you do?
I think I said towards the beginning, I'm almost an old age pensioner. I have never felt so energized by any aspect of my career as I am now. I have had the benefit of seeing this work in practice. I started doing this by redeploying people who were at risk of losing their jobs and finding ways for them to get other opportunities that existed but were simply not visible to them. And in finding them with a wonderful group of people who were all dedicated to the cause, we helped about 500 people to not lose their jobs. Somebody just coming back and saying, you helped, and I really appreciate it. And sometimes that was people that we weren't able to help, but they still appreciated the fact that we tried. That is at its most visceral, but at every stratum, from the very individual right the way up to the strategic, this is a fascinating place to be right now. And I've got no real desire to stop until Fiona says, hang on a minute, is the time you retired? Not soon, I hope.
Not soon.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening. If this podcast got you thinking differently about how work happens, that's what we're here for.
We dig into these topics every week in our research and in the Red Thread community. The Red Thread community is a place where people, leaders, and practitioners come together to compare notes, share what's working, and maybe challenge those things that aren't working so well. You can join for free at redthreadresearch.com/membership. Or if you or your organization are ready to go deeper, take a look at our professional and our enterprise memberships. For professional tier, for listeners, you can use the promotional code STORIES, STORIES, for a 10% discount. And if you're a tech provider trying to make sense of this space, our tech consortium is where smart vendors are coming together to learn from each other and from the market. You'll find everything at redthreadresearch.com. I'm Danny Johnson. Thanks for listening and for caring about making work better.
Okay, that's a wrap for this episode of Workplace Stories. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast so that you can be the first to know about future episodes. For exclusive access to our research, insights, and a vibrant network of human capital leaders, consider joining the Red Thread Research community. Visit redthreadresearch.com to learn more and to take your workplace to the next level.